relatively new thing that you don't need to use it. Okay. Okay, so init methods. So up till now, we just used init. Remember, you should always initialize something, but you don't need to initialize it with just init. You can define your own initialization methods. And if you look at, well, when you're actually doing iOS, you're going to be dealing with a bunch of other initialization methods. But the convention is that the initialization methods are always going to start with lowercase init. And then, so reading this method, we have a instance method, because it's a dash. It's going to return an ID. So this is also convention. We know that it is necessarily returning a student star. And remember that ID is just sort of like a catch-all for all objects. The convention for initialization methods is that they return ID. Then this is pretty much the convention too, that we have init with name colon, and we pass it the name. And notice now we are passing a second argument, so space and age colon age. So the name of this method is init with name colon and age colon. That name and age are arguments. Those are not part of the name of the method. So we already see how these names can get pretty long. Believe me when I say that there are method names that are like 4 times longer than this in iOS dealings that you will be using. So there's one other, I don't remember. Questions? Yes, it's very similar to void star, except it's dealing with objects instead of general pointers. And we'll see ID in other places too. And it's also similar to void star in that automatic casting happens.
Could you just go over that one time?
This whole thing? Okay, so we have instance method. It is returning an ID, so that's just the way it is. If you wanted, you could say student star, but you shouldn't. You should say ID because any initialization method pretty much returns ID. Then the convention is that you're going to init, and then with is also pretty much the convention. Any colon, you can count the colons to determine the number of arguments to a function. So here we see 2 colons. That means we know there are going to be 2 arguments. The first argument is called name and is of type NS string star. The second argument is called age and is of type int. So when we want to actually call this function, we might say, like, well, first we allocate a student, and then we say student init with name colon at Bob space and age colon 21. And we'll see an example of that in another student's 4 or 5 or whatever.
Is it possible to have multiple initializing functions name the same thing if they have different, like I know that like in C you have constructors that are all named the same thing, but if you pass different variables to them, they can do different things.
So the answer is no, but that should never be the case. Because if the variables are different, this naming scheme should be different. This is how you name methods in all method names are very long and explicit in Objective-C. And so if we decided that instead we wanted to just initialize with the name, then we would have an init with name method without the and age. If we wanted to just do name, we would have an init with age method without the and name or whatever. Yeah. That was a typo that has been fixed. These will be uploaded at the end. There are some changes. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, we would just put more. And gender and year and whatever. It's the number of colons specifies. In theory, we don't need to say and age. Like a valid method name is init : which because there are 2 colons, we expect there to be 2 arguments, and so we can call it with like init colon Bob colon 20, but that's not what you should do in Objective-C. You should explicitly name all of your parameters. So init with name colon whatever, and age colon whatever.
Like in JavaScript, can you pass in like an object or a dictionary or something?
You cannot by default pass in a dictionary or object or anything like that. This is pretty much the only way you can run it, unless you happen to define an initialization method that like takes what we'll see later, like an NS dictionary. But that's up to you to define such an initialization method. But you pretty much shouldn't. This is the way it should be. And also, if you follow this convention, I'm pretty sure Xcode is going to give you some like some more advanced tips in auto-completions and stuff. The convention being like, this should return ID. This should start with the 4 letters init. And when someone's reading your code, they expect you to initialize something, so they should see the 4 letters init. Okay, looking at this example. Six. Okay, so in student.h, we see we are now declaring a new method, exactly what we saw before. Now that we have said that we are using this method, we need to implement that method in the .m file. So here, let's first look at the init with name. So this is a very common pattern. Whenever you define your own initializer, this is pretty much the pattern you want to take, where the, should we, for a second, let's say this first. So this is somewhat weird from other languages where like self is just sort of like a keyword. Here, self is a variable, and you're assigning to that variable the result of initializing your superclass. So again, this is part of the pattern that you pretty much always do. So just because I happen to inherit from NS object, which its initialization method does nothing, but imagine that it does do something. So just because I know how I want to be initialized doesn't mean I know how my parent class wants to be initialized. So you should always call your parent class an initializer of your parent class. So the reason we assign to self and do this whole if self equals superinit thing is under some bizarre scenario where initializing the superclass manages to return nil or something, like initialization went wrong, then we don't want to do these 2 things. As an example, maybe we just happen to define the initializer as like only 5 objects of this class type should ever be initialized. After 5, it should just fail. And so then when they try to initialize, if it's after 5, presumably this super init is going to fail, and self will be nil, and then we'll just return self. Yes?
Is self similar to this in Java?
Yes, yes, yes. Self, this are 2 things you see in languages. There is no this in Objective-C. They just call it self. It means this current object. So when I have a student, like I just allocated a student, and then I pass that student the message init with name whatever, then self refers to that student I just passed the message to. And so similarly, self.age, which is also equivalent to self set age age. So self.age refers to this student. We want to set our own age instance variable to age.
Do you need to spell out the original init function or is it just calling any init with something?
Which do you need to spell out? Spell out. Oh, this? So this gets into that there should always be, and you can look up these exact words, designated initializer. So not really going to go into deep detail here, but every class should have exactly one designated initializer. And this is, in other languages, you might see it as like you define one constructor that sort of all other constructors that you have call. And so here, we decide that init_with_name should be our designated initializer, which means that init needs to call our designated initializer. If we then define